are recording this conversation in this course. So if you don't feel comfortable with that, feel free to hop off, but this will be recorded and we will put it on our website and our archives once the course is over with. So just know that going into it. All right, I'm going to pull this PowerPoint up on the screen right now. Having a little trouble right now. It's asking for permissions. Okay. So on your screen, I'd like to address myself as I'm Skylar St. Ives. I'm our R3 fishing coordinator. For those of you who don't know what R3 is, it's recruitment, retention, reactivation. And that focuses on outdoors folks who are, for recruitment, either novice or new, intermediates who are right on that fringe of self-sufficient. They can go to the bait or tackle shop or ammunition store and go out in the field. And then reactivation for hunters and anglers who have participated at one point in time but have lapsed for any number of reasons. So we're going to pull up this PowerPoint now for close to home in ponds. And the first subject that we are going to talk about is going to be sunfish, like what species. So you want to find a local spot. So depending on where you live, our close to home areas exist in virtually every corner of the state. We have them in Enid, Lawton, Durant, the Tulsa area, and Oklahoma City. If you don't live within 30 minutes of one of those metro areas, odds are you're probably not that far from a small impoundment, whether it be a pond or a lake that's going to fit what this course is going to help teach you. So the most important thing is identifying what it is you want to catch. You know, most ponds you're looking at either bluegill, green sunfish, any number of that type of panfish, crappie in some, and then bass and catfish. But sunfish, bass, and catfish are going to be your primary species that you're going to find throughout Oklahoma in any given body of water at any given time. And then what type of gear do you like to use? Do you want to use? If you're here in this course because you've never fished before, we'll go over some of those things. If you have fished and you're just looking to gain some more information, we'll go through that as well, whether you're a bait or an artificial angler. And then obviously there is no substitute for actually fishing. So anybody who's in this course who thinks they're going to get that miraculous how-to, they go out there the next time and they're just going to nail them. That's not the case. I mean, fishing is fishing. It's not called catching, and that's for a reason. So I'm going to pull back up my main screen and stop presenting for a moment so we can go over some of these topics on my screen. And we'll first start with sunfish. So this is obviously the most basic of fish species. You show up, they're very easy to catch. They're usually in high numbers, quality and quantity, depending on the body of water. But the basics that you're looking for, and this is going to help you with every other type of fishing. If you know how to catch sunfish, you will figure out how to catch all the other fish just by knowing what that lowest on the food chain is doing. And that's what bluegill are in most ponds. So unless you have a abundance of like golden shiners, minnows, or other bait fish, sunfish are the main forage for every species that's in your pond, whether it be crappie, catfish, bass, or something else. That's what they eat. So knowing where they are and how they react and how they fish, and not only that, but they're fun to catch as well. So the one thing that I always do anywhere I go, it could be a big reservoir, local pond, whatever, start with sunfish. So the first thing that you want to do when you get there is identify where you can catch sunfish. So a very small hook, just that right there is, I mean, you can see it in relationship to my fingernail. Nothing. One piece of split shot, and I prefer a straight vertical bobber as opposed to your, you know, circle bobber. That's just a personal preference. I feel like these go under quicker and notify you of bites better than a round bobber. Round bobber's got more resistance on the surface of the water. It might move. This bobber either slips straight under or it turns, which helps you identify whether or not you have a bite. The first place you want to focus on for sunfish is going to be shallow coves in a pond. So most ponds, if we're going to identify what a pond is, let's say for argument's sake, 2 or less acres, anything over that we could call a pond, but more like a small private lake. You're going to want to focus on the dam first. Your dam's going to provide structure of any kind when it was built, whether it's a sloped dirt, if there's riprap, whatever, most of the natural bottom structure. And for those of you who don't know what structure is anything that is in the water based. Like, so it's a part of the contours of the pond. So that's going to be logs, rocks, slopes on dirt, ditches, creek beds. All of that is, anytime you hear fishing and you hear structure, that's what that means. Cover is anything that is not a part of that pond base, but is providing some type of shelter. It could be in or out of the water. It could be an overhead branch that provides shade during the day. It could be lily pads that are on the surface. It could be hydrilla. It could be moss beds, weed beds, whatever. So those are important. If any of you are just beginning anglers looking to get more knowledgeable and just conversational at a bait shop or on a fishing forum, cover and structure are going to be the words that you come across more than anything. Sometimes they're used in the same vernacular sense, but they might mean different things to different people. But identifying those is going to be very helpful for anybody who wants to just be involved in fishing moving forward. So taking that small hook, weight and bobber. Some people use worms. Worms are effective. Crickets are effective. Anything. I like crappie nibbles. They are about $3 at any Walmart, Academy, anything. You can get them. They don't make a mess. The one thing that I have problems with worms is that you're taking them out of the carton. They have all of that natural film that's in there on them, and as well as the dirt. You might wear a towel on your leg and try to use it, but more than likely you just end up rubbing it on the side of your pant legs, and you mess up a pair of pants pretty quick. So crappie nibbles, clean, don't need refrigeration, last forever. You can throw them in a bag, a truck, whatever. But these will work as good as worms anywhere, any time of the year. So all you're looking to do is essentially your search bait fishing. So going to a dam first, you want to fish the corners of both dams, or corners off of each side of the dam. You're going to usually have some type of bay structure where you have deeper water coming up towards the dam, and those little tail-offs, you know, you could have low water or high water, but it's moving into those areas where you have nice gradual transition areas. And sunfish, being the lowest member of the food chain in a pond, are always seeking areas where they have the most shelter. So going with a bobber and a hook, you know, maybe 6 inches, 8 inches below, depending on water depth. But if you're in a pond, you're probably under a foot. Make casts to those areas. Cover the entire body of water. The biggest thing that I hear, I fish the same ponds 200 days a year. Maybe there's 6 or 8 of them. I fish them 200 days a year. Day, night, midday, doesn't matter. Rain, shine, middle of summer, dead of winter. They always fish fairly the same way. Those fish move, but they're always in those same groups. So fishing the entire pond with a good starting point where you can find those fish immediately to have success, because ultimately that's the goal when you go fishing. You want to catch fish. But being in those corners of the dam and then going from there. Now, if you just hammer fish right there, don't leave. I mean, keep on fish, never abandon fish. But ponds that you fish frequently, fish them all over at all different depths at as much as you can, because you are going to learn more about that pond by being there than any one of your family members, friends, myself, a website, a forum is going to tell you. There's just no substitute for fishing. Now, once you identify catching sunfish and you know how big they are, now if you're catching 4 to 6 inch sunfish that are, you know, yay big, they're not bigger than your hand, you're probably just going to want to stick with that crappie nibble, worm, and bobber. Now, if you start catching fish, especially in the spring, so anywhere from early April to mid-June in Oklahoma, the best time, hands down, to fish for sunfish in shallow waters, as described, is going to be May through 2 weeks into June. That is the window. Every single sunfish will move up into those areas around dams or around those coves that have that very gradual shallow water, and they're going to spawn there. You'll see their beds. They're the size of a soccer ball, a basketball, just in diameter, but that's it. And they're very easy to recognize because they build them in, you know, they'll build them less than 4 inches of water. But by identifying where they're at and catching them, that is going to lead to success if you're interested in catching other species in your pond, primarily bass, crappie, and catfish. So if you do find some sunfish that are bigger size, that are in that 8 to 12 inch range, and now 12 inches for a sunfish that's trophy size. I mean, really anything over 10 inches is a pretty incredible fish. Your standard bluegill or green sunfish or hybrid or red is going to fall in that, you know, 4 to 8 inch. And once you get to that 6 to 8, you can catch them with other things. I prefer using tubes. Everybody has their preference. There's really no right or wrong answer, but anything in green pumpkin. So this is called a Crappie Max Squirm and Squirt. It is 2 inches. It's got tail. You pre-rig them. So you take a jig head. So I'll rip this one off here to show you how that lines up. I pre-rig these. So you buy them in a pack that looks like this. It's just the plastic. You buy accompanying jig heads to put on. I like 1/32 ounce. Most ponds that you're going to fish get shell shocked. And what I mean by that is people are throwing buzz baits, topwater, crankbaits, spinner baits. You have a very small ecosystem in there, and that's not really mimicking anything that's going on within that pond, which is the most important. I mean, in order to catch fish, you have to mimic their natural behavior as much as possible. So my recommendation to anybody fishing for any species in a pond, downsize, downsize, downsize. You can see how big this is. I mean, that's resting on my thumb. I've caught 7-pound bass with this. I catch 3-pound bass with this as consistent as anything else I can throw in ponds. So this paired with 6 to 8 pound test on any type of rod, I mean, 5 foot to 7 foot, that's medium action, that will get the job done. And you can fish it a number of ways. If you just throw it in and straight retrieve, that tail is going to give you just a little bit of motion. I pop it, so I'm just constantly just flicking that rod tip and reeling as slow as possible. And that doesn't change. It could be the dead of winter or the dead of summer or the hot times of the year in the spring or fall. Slower, smaller, and more finesse is always going to improve your success for any species. And sunfish in particular, because you will catch sunfish like crazy for 6 weeks of the year. And then you're like, where'd they go? They're not, I don't see fish. I can't catch them. I'm using the same thing. They're nowhere to be found. Well, they're just retreating to a little bit deeper water, and they're just looking for a different presentation, because during the spawn for all fish, they are either feeding instinctually to feed their eggs, or males are feeding to protect nests. And that's it. It's cause and effect. So the other 11 and a half months of the year for any species. Small, quiet, just fish slow is going to provide you the most success. So this is my go-to for every species. I mean, this is kind of my cure-all for anything in a pond. Other things that work well for sunfish are going to be things that are like, you know, just a little swim bait. Not quite sure what the brand for these is. I think this is just like a generic, maybe Bass Pro. What I really like, my favorite at least, are going to be Bobby Garland's without the bumper tail. So here is one that's on a 30-second, or this is a 16th ounce jig head. Again, it's about the same size as that tube that I just showed. I like this color the best. This is called Screamin' Shad. It's Mo Glow. They have two different types of Bobby Garlands for colors, but they also have ones that have bumpers on them. So these ones with the bumper are meant to be swim. So you cast these straight out and then straight retrieve. And that little bumper on the end of the tail is causing that vibration that stimulates the lateral line that's on fish that tells them when, you know, to attack their prey. I like the ones without the bumpers, but that's because I prefer very slow, erratic finesse fishing. That tail always moves in the water. That never stops moving. So it's just designed in a way that you don't even need current or wind or anything. If you just hold that in a glass of water with a piece of line, that tail will just subtly move. And that's going to stimulate your sunfish, crappie, even bass will bite that. Catfish will bite it at right times of the year. But again, sticking with the theme of keep it small. I mean, here's all of these lures that I use that are going to be successful year round, and all of them fit into the palm of my hand. You know, you go to a Bass Pro or a Walmart Academy, most people, they get on the bass aisle and everything is, you know, something that looks more like this or like this. I mean, these are huge. I mean, that's 8 inches long. It's really not going to help benefit you catching a multitude of species, which I think is really the essence of pond fishing. You don't go to a pond with the expectation that you're going to catch a 50-pound fish, but you go to a pond with the expectation that in the evening, you're going to catch maybe 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 fish of different sizes and species. And those sunfish are where you start. So let's move on to, hold on. Ron said, are those all cast and retrieve? Yes. So everything that we have here, everything I'm going to show you today is all cast and retrieve. How you fish it is up to you. But if you want to straight throw it out and reel it in, that's what they're designed to do. Everybody finds their own preference on how they're going to fish. Like I said, I prefer like just as slow as possible on an open bail spinning reel, just always working the rod tip. So just very, let's grab just a rod tip right here. So the tip of this rod when I'm fishing is always just doing as I'm retrieving, and I'm just going as slow as possible. And I do that year round. It doesn't, no float. And you can't, again, you can float it. Now, all these baits are designed to fish how you want. So if you want to go with a straight, like, you know, whether it be a swim bait, a jig, I mean, even a pre-made swim bait, if you want to fish it with the float and just, you pull up on the rod and that bobber does this on the water and comes up, and then that bait is sitting there like this. So every time you jig it, it does that and it stops. That's a very effective way to fish. It's called bobber jigging. Lots of people employ it for crappie. I know guys who do it for bass, especially on small water. Anytime that you can keep a bait in the strike zone, which in a pond is generally going to be somewhere between a foot below the surface and 5 feet below the surface. Outside of that, if it's deeper than that, then we're talking more of a lake than we are a pond. Anything deeper than 12 to 15 foot is in that small of an area, less than 2 acres. That's going to create a fairly weird dynamic in your pond because it's basically like a strip pit. You have a big deep hole. So all of this conversation in this course is based around fishing water less than 15 feet, less than 2 acres. And all of these baits are all cast and retrieve. If you want it as basic as possible, throw it out, reel it in. And everything that I'm going to show you today will catch fish. And in some instances, depending on the pond, it might be lights out. I mean, you might just be drilling fish. So we're going to move on to crappie. Crappie are a lot like sunfish. However, crappie are more easy to target in a specific location for about 2 months a year. You get and that's in the spring. That's going to be late March through early May. I mean, obviously dependent on weather. It's Oklahoma. Small ponds are much more affected by rising day and mainly overnight temps. So during the summer, when overnight lows are only 75, your water's never going to dip below low 80s, high 70s. And same thing in the spring. You're coming out of cold winter months. Water temps are going from 45 to 65 in the span of maybe 10 days, because all it takes is 5 to 7 days of overnight lows being high enough with those daytime highs to increase, you know, your pond's surface temperature and, you know, for the most part, the entire body of the water. So for crappie, that happens late March through early May, but we'll just say April to keep things concise. Crappie love structure. They are a structure-based fish. You'll hear stories of guys who will target crappie on big reservoirs in open water, and they're like, we're hammering crappie in 25 feet. Well, they were in 25 feet of open water, but there was probably some type of structure that those fish were either right above or very near to retreat to. Crappie like to form schools. Sunfish do as well. I mean, your bluegill and your green sunfish, they form loose schools, but crappie for the most part are a pretty prolific schooling fish, especially at times of the year when they're spawning. So if you find one crappie, you're going to find 15. You're going to find 20. You're going to find 30 if you're using something that they are actively engaged in. Again, you might hear a lot of stuff if you're on fishing forums or you're going to a bait or tackle shop or you're just talking to buddies. People are like, oh, they're only hitting on pink or they're only hitting on chartreuse. I don't think crappie are truly as dependent on color as they are presentation, how it is in front of them in a given period of time. Crappie are primarily a piscator. They're not, you know, they're eating fish. Whereas, you know, sunfish might surface and eat, you know, bugs that land on the water. They might try to eat a small insect on the bottom of a pond, or crayfish like bass eat crawfish, and bass and catfish are kind of like dumpsters. They'll pretty much eat anything that moves in front of them. Crappie are a little bit more particular. That's why they're called one of the best tasting freshwater fish outside of walleye, because they are a white fish. They almost strictly eat other fish. So the quality of their flesh is very light, flaky, and white. There's not a lot of, you know, coloration to them. Again, when I showed you for sunfish in ponds, these are my two go-tos. Bobby Garland, Crappie Max. You could use a white or like a blue. Let me pull up a couple other examples other than that same color, just because to each their own. I honestly don't think there's a difference. I just prefer a particular color for me. That's what I use. But I mean, you could go with like a ghost blue or a pearl white, or, you know, I try to avoid unnatural colors. So again, with crappie, people talk about killing them in electric, killing them in pink, killing them in purple. To each their own. But I prefer natural colors. And in Oklahoma, your natural coloration base for anything, if it is terrestrial based or even a fish base, green pumpkin. That's your base color. From there, I found that black and red flakes that are mixed in, that seems to do the trick in more places. Again, every pond, every body of water is going to be fish differently, but we're trying to give you information that is tried and true in more than just one spot. And that's that everything I'm going to show you today has caught fish all over the state, every different type of water. So we're going to try to get you to that point. Because like I said, each one of you is going to enjoy fishing different than the other person. So hopefully something in this course is going to just give you that spark where it's like, man, that's what I want to do. That's how I want to fish. Again, crappie and sunfish, rooster tails. People think of them for trout. They think of them, you know, as a beginner bait. Just an olive green. See if I can detach one of these brown ones. These are my two tried and true colors in the state. Light brown and then olive green. One of them's just a standard rooster tail with the gold right here. This one is called a Vibric rooster tail. The blade is just a little bit different. It's more concave. It's more like a Oklahoma blade or a Colorado blade as opposed to just a straight. This one would probably be considered like a willow blade. It's flat and elongated. But these two, never underestimate rooster tails. Unbelievable. They provide everything that you need. They're small. They produce vibration. They produce sound. They produce just that action that, again, those lateral lines on those fish, where whether it's a catfish, a crappie, a bass, or a sunfish, that is what they're looking for. And again, they're looking for things that live in their environment. So the smaller is more realistic to them. That's what they see more often. And, you know, the bigger the fish gets, you might hear, well, a big fish, big bait. That's true. I mean, at certain times of the year, a big fish is only going to be willing to expend a certain amount of calories to get a caloric intake. So if that's eating a huge bullfrog on the top of the water, and that's the only time they feed all day, they'll do that. But if you put a small, natural looking bait in front of any fish, any time of the year, if it is a natural moving presentation for that fish on that particular day, they're going to eat it. That's just, they're not. We have live scope and all these things now where guys, you know, they send their bait down, they have a camera, they can see what it's doing. They're like, oh, it's not that color, it's not this color. Well, they do the same thing. The only thing they're changing is the color or the size maybe, but they're not actually changing the presentation. So the presentation is the most important thing that you will ever find fishing. And it changes. Like I said, you can fish hard and fast all day long. Cast that sucker straight out and reel it in as fast as possible. Erratic. I personally think that in ponds, a slow, steady retrieve or a slow retrieve with minimal natural-based action is your best bet. So finishing off the crappie topic of where they are in a pond, unlike the sunfish that you're looking for in those really shallow bays around the dam, look for any type of structure that is sticking out of the water for crappie. Obviously, log laydowns, think fallen trees. Those are position A. But don't discount like a bank that comes in with a root, like a tree that's growing. It's on the bank of the water, but underneath it, you have growth into the water. There's a lot of things that, rest underneath cut banks and ponds that you might not see. And in April, those crappie move in to do their natural spawning routine. They come out of that deeper water where they're holding in 6 to 8 feet in a pond. And then they move into 6 inches of water and they're just stacked on top of each other. So identifying those areas where there's laydowns and there's hangups, that's where you're going to target crappie. But the other 11 months of the year, those fish are doing the same thing. They might not be as tightly packed together. So where you might catch 15 and 15 casts at the same exact spot, you might catch 5 or 6. But those fish are forming a loose school, and just think of them in a water column. If it's any other time of the year, they're out here in the deep. And then when it comes April, they're just slowly moving up those ridges in a pond until they reach those nice, flat, shallow, sheltered spawning areas that all fish use. Outside of catfish in this presentation, bass, crappie, and sunfish, they all use the same general bedding areas. In some instances, you'll see a bass building a bed out of 3 crappie beds that were there. Crappie bed in a little bit deeper water than bass and sunfish. Generally, you can see bass and sunfish on their beds. Crappie, depending on water clarity, they're probably going to be out a little bit deeper, and that's relative. Deeper is only going to be 4 feet as opposed to 1.5 feet. But again, any type of minnows for artificials. Now, if you're a bait angler for crappie, go to a bait store, buy minnows that are, somewhere in the size if you want to fish them live. And if you want to fish a live bait for either sunfish or for crappie, just something like this, nothing much bigger. This is just a small bait holder. It's classified as an octopus hook, but you could call this a plain shank bait hook. The eyelid's a little offset on the top. That doesn't matter. But you would be taking your minnow. So if you had your live minnow, there's a couple different ways you can bait it. Most people go right through the top of the head. So either through like what's considered the nostrils of the fish. You hook them like that. And then when they go in the water, they're trying to swim. If you're using a little bit bigger, you might, some people put them right behind the dorsal fin. So if this is your minnow and the dorsal fin is right here, you hook it right behind that. That's how I like to hook them. I hook them back towards the tail, just because the majority of predatory fish, they're always attempting to attack from either behind or below. Doesn't matter where they fall on the food chain. It could be a sunfish. It could be a 10-pound bass. Every fish that's an ambush predator, which is going to be every fish you find in a pond, they're looking to get that bait moving away from them. It's all about, that's why fish have dark backs. You ever pull a fish out of the water and you wonder why they have these bright underbellies and then a really dark back? Well, if you're in the water and you're looking straight down, they blend into that, either the water or to the floor. And then if you're looking up and you see those bright lights, if you're underwater and you've ever looked up before and you look at the sky, you can't really make out any defining features, but you see that bright coloration. That's why their bellies are shaped that way. So when you look and think of fish as what they are, which is they're predators, and they're ambush predators, understanding how they're built is going to help you understand when you're throwing a bait out over and over and over again. You're like, man, I can't catch any fish. Like, I'm throwing this worm out. I'm going over and over again. You're probably reeling too fast, or you're probably reeling too slow, or you're not in that section of the water column where the fish is at, which is why pond fishing is like the pinnacle of learning how to fish. Because it's a tight area. A reservoir, people who are good at fishing reservoirs fish reservoirs as if they're little ponds. They find areas within a big reservoir that mimics the same thing that you'd get out of a pond. So that's why it's as important. I address another question. I didn't see this one earlier. What do you mean by finesse fishing or erratic fishing? So there's generally like maybe 3 or 4 different types of classifications of fishing that you'll hear used over and over again. Power fishing, topwater fishing, and finesse fishing. There's microcosms within all those. Basically what finesse fishing is either using no weight or very minimal weight. So when you throw a crankbait, or you throw like a big swim bait, or you're throwing bait that you have like an ounce lead, like, an egg weight or something like this, where you really have a lot of weight, finesse fishing is generally associated with open bail spinning reels, fished in, you can finesse fish in 50 feet of water if you want to, but mostly associated with flipping and pitching. Finesse baits, again, flipping and pitching, we'll get way derailed on the different terminology you can go into. But finesse fishing is usually spinning, open-faced spinning reel, casting light, weightless, or very lightly weighted baits and working them incredibly slowly. That could be dead sticking. There are people who will throw a worm out like a fake worm, an artificial, they will sit it on the bottom and they will not move it. And they will wait 2-3 minutes and then do this. And then let it fall right back down. And they're waiting for that fish to see that worm kind of sitting on the bottom. You know, even in a pond, there's current. You know, the water's always moving, even when it looks stagnant. And these baits, especially plastic, artificial, you know, soft plastic baits, are meant to take advantage of that moving water. So, you know, the end of that bait might just be doing this. And that's all it takes. And so that's finesse fishing, is slow, barely bouncing it along the bottom. You know, just, you might make one cast and it's 6 minutes until you actually get your lure back to where you're casting again. So that's generally how finesse fishing is addressed. So let's move into bass. Again, kind of storm through this because I really want the last hour for you guys to be able to interact and ask questions, because for some of you, you may know all this and you want to know something different. So we'll try to move through this a little bit quicker than we have been. So bass in a pond is to each their own. Sunfish and crappie, even catfish, pretty consistent across the board. Bass are a very unique species in that they all do the same thing in the same body of water. So you hear guys talk about pattern. I got them patterned. I got them figured out. I figured out the pattern. When they say pattern, it is not a particular lure. It's not a particular presentation. It's not any one thing. Pattern is, what are the majority of bass that are biting today? What are they biting? I mean, what are they biting the same thing of? First, some days it could be a jig that's a certain color being bounced along the bottom, and you hear a guy saying, I got them patterned. Especially tournament fishermen, they talk about patterns all the time. Well, the next day you might get out there, same body of water, same everything, and now those same fish are looking for a terrestrial. They're all looking up. They're looking for, you know, maybe the bait fish in the pond. The minnows are spawning, or the minnows are schooled in an area where every bass has now moved away from bottom feeding for crustaceans or insects, and they've now turned their attention to something up higher in the water column. Happens all the time. Sometimes it happens throughout the course of the same day. You might be hammering fish off the bottom using a jig or a swim bait, or it just bounced. And then 2 hours later, it just shuts off, but you're seeing surface activity, and you go and you throw a topwater bait on, or you throw a swim bait that's meant to be fished high in the water column, and all of a sudden you're back on them. So that's what a pattern is. Fish follow a very similar cycle, especially in small bodies of water. You hear the terminology a lot in fly fishing: match the hatch, match the hatch, match the hatch. All those trout, all those river fish, they are looking for a particular bug on a particular day because they know the life cycle. They know what that is on either a daily, monthly, annual cycle. Fish in stagnant water all have that same DNA ingrained in them. So on any given day, they are looking for something that we as anglers are trying to mimic in the best way possible. So when you get to a pond, especially for bass fishing, crappie, sunfish, you can walk around the entire pond and just fish. And if you use any number of the baits that I showed you, if you use just natural bait, you're going to find fish. It doesn't matter what time of year, you're going to find fish just doing that. Bass, especially on a pond, I like to read that water like I would if I was out on the West Coast or Montana or Idaho reading a river, watching what the bugs are doing, you can learn a lot from the surface of the water in 5 minutes, just standing there. If you see a lot of surface activity, which is like, you know, you might see that V that's flying across the water, you know, you'll see that, and those are bait fish that are darting. That dorsal fin on them just below the surface is creating that mini wake. And generally when you see a lot of that happening, either those fish are feeding or something is feeding on them. Both are good. If they're feeding, it's going to stimulate predators to feed. if there is nothing going on the surface of a pond, if it's a calm, one of the 2 days a year in Oklahoma where the wind isn't blowing and it's flat surface and there's nothing going, don't throw topwater. Don't throw, I mean, maybe throw topwater off the bank like at night, but don't throw swim baits on like anything in the upper surface of the water column, because the water is telling you that there's no activity in that. And most fish on any given body of water, 90% of fish are in 10% of water. So you get to a pond, it might be 1 acre, and you're like, oh man, I just throw it wherever, I'll catch fish. 90% of those fish are holed up in 10% of that total water. That's important to understand. So anytime you fish new water, right when you get there, just look at the surface. If the surface is exploding with activity, throw swim baits, throw things like this, pre-made swim baits. Run them fast in the top of the water column. See if you get bites. Nothing? Okay, maybe go to like a stick worm that you either fish. You can either throw a bass, a big aught hook through the top and fish it to where when it falls, it's kind of doing this, or you can wacky rig it and just throw a hook right through the middle. But when that thing hits the water, you have no weight on it. Just work it, just a couple of quick pops and keep it on the surface of the water. Now, if you see nothing on the surface, do that same exact thing, but let your bait fall. Let it get well down into the water column and then work it that way. And your bass, again, are going to hover around very, very similar structure that bluegill are. Most of a bass's diet is sunfish. They eat crawfish, they eat frogs, big ones will eat baby ducks, they'll eat rats or muskrat, they'll eat just about anything they can get their mouth on, but their primary forage is always going to be sunfish. So knowing where sunfish are on a pond is going to be very beneficial of knowing where bass are, especially in relationship to cover and structure. So if there's a bunch of sunfish that you see in the corner of a pond and they're all holding really shallow and you're kind of like, why is there all these sunfish here? They're not really doing anything. There's probably a bunch of bass just out of view that basically has them corralled to where they're not doing anything. And so swim baits and weedless types of stick worms, that's what I prefer. Lizards, again, something in a green base with some red and some black mixed in. This is just a 4-inch lizard. You could fish this again with, let me pull out a bass hook to show you guys what I was talking about with either wacky rigging or just standard offset. So this is just a standard, this is a 3/0 standard offset worm hook. But you don't have to use it for a worm. You can use it for a lizard or anything. What it's meant to do is it's meant to fish weedless. So when you take your stick worm and you want to fish it weedless, you're going to go right through the top of that worm for maybe a fingernail length and then pop that hook through. So it looks just like that. Then you're going to thread it all the way up the hook to the top and then turn it on the top. The hook, just spin the hook. So now that back is facing the offset. And then you're just going to take that offset and you run it right through the body of the worm. And then that little hook point, if I bend it in, you can see it a little bit. You just lightly embed that. Just like that. There. I can fish that with a bullet weight. I prefer to fish weedless or weightless. Anytime I'm in a pond, I don't use weight if I can avoid it. Now, like this little deal, that's a 32nd ounce jig head or a 64th ounce jig. It's basically weightless. I mean, it's pretty much the weight of the hook with just a little bit of lead. So this is going to help you. So when this hits the water, the heavy side generally is here on the eyelid. So if you're fishing a jig or with a bullet weight or with the weight, it's meant to go this way because that's where the majority of the weight is. When you fish it weedless and weightless, this is your heavy part. All this action back here, when it hits the water, it's going down. So this would obviously have some water. So it's going to go like this. And again, all you're doing is when you pick up the rod tip, it's just doing this. sitting there, it's floated down. You pick it up and it pops up, and that tail flips like, you know, and then it just slowly tinkers back down. And you get all of that action, and that is what is sending off vibrations into the water. This is going to stimulate your bass. So stickworm, you do the same thing with that lizard. You take the lizard, you do the same thing. Go right through the head of it and go out. Most lizards that they make have little eyes on them. I mean, fake eyes with the plastic. Go through the what would be considered the belly side. So the underside of the jaw, same deal. Hook it right through, pull it all the way up, spin the hook, and then thread it back through. And then you can fish it weedless. And with the lizard, again, I fish them weightless. Some guys will use like a very, very small bullet weight. And all you're doing with the lizard, just a steady retrieve. You see all those appendages hanging off? I mean, fish don't really know it's a lizard or a frog. I mean, they're seeing what they know is a predatory instinct to attack. So things that have lots of appendages on them that are fish slowly causing vibrations and match the general color scheme of what that fish is looking for, which in Oklahoma is going to be your bases of dark green, red, black, even to some extent like a June bug color. See if I think I have a June bug. June bug colors are pretty cool. They're that purple. Here's a red. Oh, here's the June bug. So here's a couple of different kind of maybe non-natural colors that stimulate. This is called June bug. It's a purple. It's got like a turquoise flake. This is really good for bass. This color scheme of anything, whether it be lizards, stick worms, regular worms, or then maybe like a black based with a red. Again, this is just a stick worm. And another way to fish these, like I had said, is wacky rigging. You might hear the term wacky rigging. Well, all a wacky rig is you get whatever bait you're using, usually a worm, and you try to hook it as close to the center as possible so that when it floats down, it's doing that as it's sinking. And then again, with the rod pop, it comes up and then it just slowly, and again, it's creating those vibrations. You've added appendages to both sides. But because we're quiet, you know, we're weedless with all this stuff and we're weightless, you're really not disrupting a bass. And you will find on heavily fished ponds, whether that be a close to home pond or whether that be a private pond or a neighborhood pond, if it gets fished multiple days a week, it doesn't really even have to be that much pressure. But those fish, they like to live throughout the course of the day and go through their natural cycle of where they exist within a water column. A lot of those fish like to get sun. So in order to do that, they have to get really, really shallow. And most of the time in a pond, that's on the bank, basically. Well, people are walking around that pond all day long. Not even anglers, just, you know, people who utilize these areas. I mean, close to home ponds as well as, you know, your neighborhood pond. You have joggers and they let dogs, you know, jump in and swim and all that stuff. So, you know, those fish moving up, they're going through all these different stages. Well, if you get out there as an angler and you start throwing really aggressive baits for bass at, you know, unusual times of the year. So let's say right now would be an unusual time of year for bass fishing a pond where they're just going to target loud movement-based baits, which are going to be crankbaits, spinner baits, buzz baits, even topwater to some extent, depending on the type of topwater. Now, if it's just a frog and you're just barely moving it around and you're creating some surface disruption, that will work. But if you're throwing a big buzz bait or a big torpedo that's just, I mean, those fish, they get shell-shocked and they get gun-shy and they also get educated. There's been tons of studies done on different species of fish of how long their memory actually is. the general consensus is that for bass, it's like I mean, depending on the study, it's anywhere from like 10 days to 3 weeks. So if you hook a bass with a particular bait and they've seen it, they've been hooked in the mouth, they associate that bait with the, you know, the pain that they felt. Fish don't feel pain like we do. It's a different type of receptive. They understand something's wrong, but it doesn't cause like physical pain. Like if you pinch your hand, you're like, ow, that hurts. You know, stimulus. They don't have that. But they have that cognitive ability for survival to recognize what is and isn't food. So you might throw this and hit a fish and you're like, man, I've killed them on it. You might tell all your buddies, man, I went out there with the June bug Senko last night. I caught 30 bass. I was just catching 2-pounder to 4-pounder. You go out the next day with your buddy, can't catch a fish. You probably stuck most of them. And they're going to recognize that. Now you go back a month later or the same time of year the next year, that bait's effective again. They lose that ability, but they are very conscious in small bodies of water of disruption. I don't know if there's any validity to this, but I do know some people who will not play music while they're fishing, like a stereo. Like if you're sitting there with your family in lawn chairs and fishing with the bobber and you got the stereo playing, those vibrations that go into the water, you know, I don't know. I would definitely say it probably isn't helping. I don't know if it's really hurting, but it's not helping. Any type of disruption outside of their natural cycle of life is just going to be a problem for those fish. So that's really what you guys need to understand for fishing ponds, for all species, but especially you bass anglers. If there's anybody in here who just wants, that's what you're after. You're trying to get that lunker 6, 7, 8, 10-pounder out of a, you know, a pond that you know can produce it. Quiet baits that are fished usually weightless you're going to get the most success. You're going to get the most bang for your buck in small bodies of water. Chatterbaits, jigs, they have their place. You will catch a big fish using one of those. But if you're willing to go to a pond and throw that same chatterbait for 4 hours, yeah, you probably catch a 4-pounder. I mean, that's just, the odds are in your favor if you're going to fish for that long. But you might only catch one fish. What's the fun in that? I mean, if you can throw something smaller and catch a multitude of species and also still catch those big fish, that is why you're going fishing. I mean, they didn't invent all this stuff just because. I mean, for somebody, it made sense to them that this is what is working. That's why when you go to a Bass Pro, it's overwhelming when you see the same bait in 37 different colors and you're like, who in the world made all these colors? Like, where are these bait fish exist? I mean, what pink and purple bait fish lives in an Oklahoma pond? So natural, weightless, weedless. And again, you don't need much more than a straight hook, just a straight worm hook, or your offset worm hook, or it's still in there, or your little wacky worm. Now at one point in time, I cut off the little weedless deals on there because I probably use this as just a bait hook for like live bait. But that's all it takes. I mean, and it doesn't even have to be a $8 pack of 5 wacky rigged hooks. I mean, it could be, you can buy a 100 pack of just basic bait shank hooks that cost, you know, $1.99. You have 100 of them. All of it works the same. Because like I said, that's a 32nd ounce hook. That's it. I mean, that hook point, it's not even bigger than my fingernail. It'll get the job done. It's hard to keep fish on for a long period of time, but it will get the job done. So let's move from bass to catfish, which if we're talking about catfish in a pond, we're probably talking about channel cats. If you have a bigger pond, an older pond, especially one that may have been dammed out of a natural creek bed, you might have either stocked or pre-existing flatheads that are in there. That fishing is going to be much different than your channel catfishing. Channel catfish is about as simple as it gets. You're either doing just straight lead off the bottom. So maybe I always use a bigger hook. You don't need to. I mean, that hook's not overly big. but just a basic circle hook that's on a leader that's tied to a swivel. And on top of that swivel, you're putting your egg weight. So something like this. That egg weight will sit, you know. So if you're stringing up line, you find one of these that it's got some line on it. I might even have just a bale of line. Yeah, we'll just do that. So let's just pretend that this line right here is actually hooked up to your reel. So here's your line. You've gone through all your eyelids. You're ready to rig up. This is what you're holding in your hand that's hooked up to your rod. So for basic catfishing, any time of the day, I mean, obviously overnight, catfish are more active during nocturnal hours, but you can catch catfish all day. The whole thing, oh, you can only catch catfish at night, that's not true. I fished plenty of lakes in plenty of different ways where you can catch your limited catfish from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. No problems. I mean, just as good as you would at night. But your basic setup for rod and reel is going to be just putting like a 1/2 ounce to 1 ounce egg weight on, and then you tie on your swivel. This one's already pre-rigged, but a swivel with a leader and your hook. So that's about 16 to 18 inches. It's about all you need. And then you tie, I always use a Palomar knot on, if I can fit it through the eyelid, Palomar all the way. It's just easier than tying an improved clinch or any other type of knot. For those of you who don't know what a Palomar knot is, it's basically a doubled over overhand knot. You just fold it in half and then loop it through, and then it pulls. So this is what you'd be looking at for your catfish setup for your pond. Egg weight, swiveled, and hook. A worm, piece of hot dog, bread, catch some sunfish. I mean, the best way to fish a pond is to get out there at 2 hours before sunset, hammer sunfish and crappie for an hour, then target bass that are feeding in those evening hours, especially because you might get some topwater bites. Save 1 or 2 of those like smaller bluegill, like your 4-inch bluegill. Have scissors, cut them in half. You caught the fish legally. You're able to use it as bait. And bluegill are not they're not a game fish. And you could do it with crappie too, if you caught the crappie legally on rod and reel. But you just cut it off, you know, a little bit of the tail, and then just thread that hook. So if this is your back half of your sunfish, all you're doing is just threading it halfway through. Let it hang like that, cast it out, let it sit. Just wait for that bite. Using circle hooks is the best way to fish because you don't need to get as aggressive with your hook set. That hook isn't going to be swallowed by the fish. Like, it's not going to cause as much problems as a hook like this. If you fish enough on ponds, you will pull plenty of those out of fish that have already been caught and either broken off, or someone was just lazy on a hook set, cut the line, went on with their day. Circle hooks are meant to where when they take the bait, it turns, it pulls to the front of their mouth, and it ends up right here. Safer for the fish. It's easier for you as an angler to get that hook in and out of the fish's mouth. But that's the best way to fish for channel cats. Now, you can go with a worm and a bobber, especially late evening. I mean, as it's getting into dark, those catfish are, for the majority of their day, are out in deeper water, hovering over drop-offs. So a pond, that may be the main creek channel that comes in from the entryway at the mouth to the dam. There's probably one pre-existing. Now, if you formed a dam or you fish a dam that was completely artificial, as in all they did was move dirt and create a dam, catfish might be a little bit more spread out. But most dams in either close to home or neighborhood ponds were built off of existing water bodies. So that's going to be a creek or a stream. So there is going to be one main branch that runs through. If you can figure out where that is, and the easiest way to do that is by casting out your egg weight and then counting the seconds of the drop. So if you cast it 15 feet from you and it's bam, it's on the bottom. Cast it 30 feet from you out farther towards the middle. Okay, that was 3 seconds. Maybe somewhere in between is that creek channel, and oh, now it's 5 seconds. Okay, I found where that drop off is. So catfishing actually in ponds helps you figure out the ponds a lot better, because if you're fishing weedless and weightless, you're not going to learn a lot about the bottom structure. You need weight for that. And most ponds you're not taking a boat on. Even the more advanced guys who were really into kayak angling, who have all the electronics on theirs, it really isn't necessary in bodies of water that are that small. You can figure it out from fishing just a handful of times. So that pretty much, that covers our species. So identifying a body of water, which is the best way to do is go fish. I promise you, if you fish enough places, you will show up to a body of water one time and be like, nah, no, I'm getting that. I'm leaving. Sometimes those ponds are the best. You might get somewhere and you're just like, man, this thing looks horrible. It's just a bowl. And you're just pulling 3-pound bass and half-pound crappie and catching decent channel. I mean, ponds are just so unique, and that some that look awesome don't fish well, and some that just look like a backyard bird feeder are just incredible. Some of that is just species genetics in the pond, structure. There's lots of varying factors ecologically for why a pond is or is not good. Some of you may have heard, don't put crappie in a pond. Crappie will overtake your pond. On average, is that true? Probably, yeah. I mean, we as a scientific agency do not recommend putting crappie in small bodies of water unless it's going to be strictly a crappie pond. They're prolific reproducers. Again, they're piscators. They're mostly just eating bait fish. So that means they're eating bass fry, catfish fry, and sunfish fry. So they're depleting your natural forage base and just structure base of the fish that are in there. But you might fish a pond that has all of them, and it's a very small body of water, and it works. And it might be great for 5-10 years, and then just natural factors happen that change a pond. So don't get discouraged if you ever, you go to a pond that maybe you fished when you were a kid or something, and you're like, man, I can't catch fish. I don't know what's going on. The pond itself might have changed. So being consistent, like I said, I only fish like 6 or 8 ponds. If I have the opportunity to go to somebody's house or farm and fish their farm pond, sure, I do it. But on average, if I'm just going to fish ponds, I fish the same 6 to 8, and I have for the last 10 years. Some of them have improved immensely. Some of them are now what I used to never fish. They were on the bottom of that 1 to 8 are now number 1. And one of the ones that was lights out the first 2 years, it's a struggle now. You get pressure, you get lots of different factors. So just identifying where you want to go and what you want to catch. So just going to the pond is your best source. If you can't do that, or maybe you got to drive a little bit, look at an overhead map. Go to Google, zoom in on the location. Obviously, you can't choose what time of year it is whenever the satellite image was taken, but you get a little bit of the lay of the land. What kind of structure or cover is around it? I mean, how many trees are on the bank? Is it just an open bowl? Does it look like it branches out? Is there an existing creek arm that comes in? Anything that has inflow, so a natural creek that flows into the mouth of what becomes the pond, those are always going to be your best fisheries, because those fish are able to live in a dynamic that more closely replicates what their natural life cycle would be had they not been enclosed in a unnatural impoundment, which is a pond or a reservoir. So that's the most important, because all you want to do is go catch fish, right? I mean, that's what we're here to do. I mean, we want to go catch fish, and how we do that is a lot of that's predicated on just knowing what type of water and understanding how those 4 species that we just talked about might exist within that body of water. And a simple aerial view from Google, or just a quick drive-by, show up, maybe not even with rods, just go to lunch break. You're like, man, there's a pond down the road. I want to go check it out. It's public. Run down, just take a quick walk around, take a look. And again, just watching the surface of the water will tell you a lot, because those bass, they chase bait. And if you have a good bass population, especially a bigger bass population, so for a pond that's going to be 2 to 4 pounds, 1 to 3 pounds, If you have a heavy dose of those in a pond, it's a good pond. It's got good structure. If you're catching a lot of bass that are all just that big, you have a stunted bass population. So that means there's probably too many in there. If it's your own private pond, anytime that the average size fish of a species you're catching is a quarter of what it should be, harvest them, take them out. Just, go on an online forum, our website. We talk about pond management on our pond page of what are correct fish ratios. But anytime that if it's your own pond and you have questions and every bass you're catching is this big and you didn't just stock it, they're not 1-year-old fish, start taking them out. And that's how you're going to rebalance your food to fish ratio of how they're going to be able to grow. So that kind of takes us through that first page of just finding a local spot. Like I said, I want to open this up here in a second for you guys to be able to ask questions. Talked about bait versus artificial ponds most of the time. If you're a beginner basic angler, cup of night crawlers from Walmart, a very basic plain shank hook, split shot, and some form of either a stick bobber or a round bobber, 6 to 12 inches below the bobber. That's your best bet. That's how you're going to learn how to fish, because you got to learn how to cast, reel, and set the hook before you can do anything else. For those of you that are a little bit more advanced, that are using artificial, like I said, small, soft plastics are your best bet. If you have a private pond where you can throw spinner baits all day long and hammer bass, good on you. I mean, that's awesome. But that's not going to be the reality. That's not going to be the majority of how you're going to be able to target fish. Even if they are targeting bait fish, whether that be minnows or bluegill, you're still better off with something that's either a pre-made swim bait like this, or something like this that is also mimicking a bait fish and how it's fished, or top water. So the next deal that we had was, and we've kind of covered everything. Most of the 3 questions that came in were finesse, cast and retrieve, and floats. So that's kind of the tactical element, and we kind of covered that in talking of all the different species. And then replicating success. Obviously, replication of success is what is going to keep you fishing. If you went fishing every day of the year and you never caught a fish, you're probably not fishing anymore. And if you enjoy fishing, obviously, the idea is every day you want to catch as many fish and as big of fish at the same time as possible. So replicating success on ponds relies on 3 things: time of year, time of day, and being able to locate those 2 things based on structure and cover. So what we talked about with like sunfish, they're going to push up and they're going to be in that shallow body of water for lots of times a day, most of the times of year. However, sunfish in December are probably the hardest species to catch in your pond consistently. They shift out from that shallow water. They go down their tiers. They find maybe an old root log or even just a hole in the ground, because every fish straight down the middle of them has what is called the lateral line. Some of them, like bass, you can see them. That's that black band that runs down it. Other fish, it's not as prevalent. You can't see it, but it's there. And what it is an external organ that helps fish identify prey sometimes from very long distances. So in a pond, a bass on one side of the pond, if you're throwing a top water on the other side, it can sense that just through its lateral line, not necessarily through sight or through sound. So these bluegill, green sunfish, red ear, they're going to go off of these shallow shelves in the winter. They're going to get into deeper water and take shelter. Because in the winter, it's the exact opposite, right? It gets really cold. So in a small body of water, the shallow water is actually colder than the deeper water. And then in the summer, it's the exact opposite. That shallow water is way hotter than the deeper water. And so where those fish exist at good fishing times of the year, so the spawn in the spring and then the pre-winter gorge in the fall when they're trying to just eat everything they can for a few weeks, sensing that winter is coming, and they're going to move out to those wintering grounds and really be more stagnant. They might only eat 1 or 2 times a day. But you're the type of angler who isn't satisfied in December or January. You know, you want to get out there and hit the pond. You still want to catch some fish. Go to the same exact spot that you went when the fishing was good, that shallow water for any species. Go right to where you had the most success. You're going to identify areas on ponds, little pockets that are on average just going to fish better than everywhere else. They're going to hold more fish, and it's probably because of bottom topography and things like that. Those fish are going to use that bottom topography. So if you're in super shallow water that's like this, and that's going to slope off into deeper water, you might have like a boulder or a root ball. All those fish are going to do is they're just going to gradually work their way out. Now, they might not be on the bottom. They might go straight out. So in relationship to cover and structure, if it's December and here's the shallow and here's the bottom, those fish might go straight out like this. They still might only be in a foot of water, but they're over 12 feet of water. And so they're moving vertically in the water column as opposed to, you know, diagonally or horizontally. So using the same baits, the same techniques, that works. It works year round. So it's just finding those fish. And if you know the times of day and the times of year, so in Oklahoma, that is going to be late March to early June. And it's going to be, depending on how quick overnight lows get down into the 40s and 50s to really drop those temps in ponds from the high 70s, low 80s down to back in the 60s. Low 60s is always that target number for almost all species outside of catfish. Catfish like 80-degree water. They're kind of the weirdos in the pond or in a creek or in a reservoir. They're very different than every other species as far as water temps are concerned. But your bass, your crappie, your sunfish, sand bass, anything like that, they are looking for that like 62 to 65 degree water. And you get that for 6 to 8 weeks, April and May, October, November. When you find a body of water that you know how to fish, and you've identified those areas for a species that you have got them, go back at other times of the year when you might want to fish. Go to that exact spot. Cast right to where with the same thing you did in April or October. Start with right where you're hammering them. No fish, no bite. Cast a little bit deeper. Cast a little bit deeper. Replicate that. Do the same motion. It's like fishing a river. When you're fly fishing on a river, you don't want to spook fish. So how do you cast? Cast as close to you upriver as possible and continue to extend, because you don't want to incidentally ever cast over a fish. A pond, you can get away with it. Rivers, you can't. You cast over a fish in a stream, you spook the fish. Happens a lot in ponds. Not as often because you got a slower drop and generally the water's a little bit more discolored so they can't see it. But you always want to hit fish. Like I said, they're ambush predators. You want to land it in front of that fish. So if that fish is facing up a ridge and it's looking up, you want to land that bait right here. You don't want to land that bait here and then reel it and then go up over the fish, because you're going to spook the fish more than likely. They don't like that. I mean, even if it's something, you know, a 5-pound bass and this comes bouncing behind it, they spook. I mean, they shouldn't. This isn't going to hurt them, but that's just their natural instinct. So you always want to be casting in front of fish. So in the winter, you're just a little bit farther, a little bit farther, a little bit farther, a little bit farther. You will eventually find fish. And in the process, you will learn so much about that pond. Fishing at bad times of year, when you're maybe only like a good day is like 10 fish in an hour or so, 2 hours. I mean, however you measure success for yourself, getting to that point when the fishing is just not lights out. Any Joe off the street can just throw something in the water and it's bang, bang, bang because it's the spawn or the fall gorge. You are teaching yourself so much just good skill for the future, not only for that body of water, but for other bodies of water, because replicating success means replicating what it was you were doing. And so knowing that fish are always in some type of relation to cover and structure, unless it's hybrid striped bass or stripers, which are not native fish. I mean, hybrid striped bass are a creation of a striped bass and a white bass. A white bass is a freshwater river run fish. A striped bass is an androgynous fish that spends its youth as a fry in a river, lives its entire life cycle in the ocean, and then it runs back. And we have found out that high salinity, which Oklahoma has in most lakes and a lot of states in the South, they've been able to impound striped bass. But those are the few fish that, because they have a relationship to the water that is very much different than your native species of freshwater fish in Oklahoma, they like open water. You know, they like open school. If you're out in the ocean, you're not sitting on the bottom, you're not sitting by a tree root, you're out in 2,000 feet of water just looking for bait balls. All other fish in Oklahoma relate to structure and cover. That's it. That's their entire life. They do not spend a lot of time just in open water. So that's why ponds are great, because it eliminates a lot of that open water that you find in a reservoir. You go to a reservoir, you might be in a creek branch in the middle of that, and you're in 30 feet of water. Can't figure out why you can't catch fish. You're like, I'm seeing fish on my depth finder. All, you know, they're probably drum. They're probably fish that are not seeking what it is you're throwing. So that pond element and scenario creates an ideal situation for you as an angler to get those basics of how fish relate to that cover and structure. Because you're going to apply that when you go to a creek, a river, a big reservoir, a small lake impoundment, a big lake impoundment. It doesn't matter. Native freshwater fish in Oklahoma are always going to identify by those two things. And then depending on time of day and time of year is going to be where they are in the water column and how they're reacting. And again, the spring, super shallow for long periods of time because they're spawning. That does not mean that all of the other months that they're not spawning, even in the winter, that they do not spend some portion of their day in that shallow water. If it's December or January, you might still be able to catch 4 and 5 pound bass in 2 foot of water because that fish decided it wanted to come out, and now the sun is hitting that really shallow water. It's only 50 degrees outside, but that direct sunlight warms it for 3 hours of the day. Now all of a sudden that shallow water is hotter than that, you know, deeper, what was warmer water that morning. Now they've moved up. They're sitting there. They're looking to feed while they're there because that sun is stimulating, you know, their reaction for prey. So those are, that's pretty much everything as far as like basic elements. So we have 40 minutes. Feel free, if you do have the ability to have your mic on, just turn your mute off, ask a question, or type it directly in the chat bar. And let's cover any specifics that you guys have. If what I covered, if you're looking for something very, you know, specific, go ahead, feel free. We'll open up the board right now. If I don't get anything in 5 minutes, I'll just keep talking because I can talk about fishing all day. But I'd really like you guys to get the most out of this. So type away or turn your mic off and ask questions, and we'll try to get the most out of this for you guys.
And then what's the mailing?
Rod and reel setup. Great question. So it's going to depend on your level. We, as mentors of anglers, state agencies, fishing groups, generally start people out with a closed bail spin casting reel, which is a button, the little button spin casters. For fishing ponds, that works. I mean, it's okay. I don't feel like they cast overly accurately. An open face bail spinning reel and rod. So you can get as heavy or as light as you want, but you're going to want to stay in that medium action. So if you go to a Walmart or a Bass Pro and you're either talking to somebody who works there or you're just looking at the rods. So every rod, let me pull one of these away. So every rod, when you get them off the shelf, if you turn them over, they have that writing on it that tells you exactly what the rod is. So this is a 5'6" medium action rod. This is the right length. And what it means by medium is that as you work your way towards the tip of the rod, you're losing a little bit of that backbone. So you're getting the bend. A very like heavy action rod is going to be a little bit more solid throughout. And that's generally more associated with like bigger fish on reservoirs, stripers, throwing big baits like umbrella rigs. So for a pond, your best bet is going to be something between a 5 foot and 6'6" spinning rod, medium to medium light, even micro. I use a micro rod, 4'6", 6 pound test on, you know, a reel that's appropriate for it, which is, you know, they're series. So like you have a reel and it's the 100 class, a 200 class, a 300 class. All that means is how much line it can actually hold on the spool. In a pond, you're obviously not going to get spooled out because the fish can only run, you know, even a big fish isn't going to run more than 40, 50 feet on you. So something that can hold at least 100 feet of 6 pound test, 8 pound test, and then a rod that is anywhere between 5 and 6.5 feet. And then you can tailor that to what you like to fish for the most. Like I said, I use a micro light rod. It's 4'6". I have 6 pound test. It's awesome for sunfish. I hook into a 5-6 pound bass. The bass is kind of in control, which is great during certain times of the year. During the summer, if you're fishing for bass, if you care about fish conservation, going back, if you're not eating that fish that you caught, if you're not keeping it, you're throwing it back, don't play fish in the hot weather. So if it's late June, July, August, September, even early October in Oklahoma, if you care about throwing that fish back and then, you know, catching it again or it being healthy to reproduce, use appropriate rod and reel to play that fish. So if it's a 5 pound bass you're targeting, use a 6.5 foot rod that's medium action with at least 12 pound test, to where when you hook that fish, you can reel it in quickly. You're not playing it other than just trying to keep it on, but you're in control. It's not taking drag. You're reeling it in. You want to get that fish in as quickly as possible, preferably wet your hands before you handle the fish and then release it. Like my micro light rod in the summer, I try to avoid areas where I know I'll catch bass. I'm trying to catch panfish. I'm trying to catch sunfish, or I'm trying to catch small bass that I'm in control of. So that's your rod and reel setup. But again, you can tailor it for whatever it is you're targeting, where you're fishing, how you're fishing, what time of year. But the standard is 5.5 foot medium action rod, 6 to 8 pound test on an open faced reel that can hold 100 yards of 6 to 8 pound. What is the best technique for fishing for trout at Delesi Park? So trout put into a pond is obviously a non-native fish. Trout outside of very, very old lineages of trout that live in real lakes, like high water mountain lakes, trout are river fish. As a whole, even though, I mean, they're bred, the ones that are put into Delesi, they're bred in rearing ponds. So all those fish know their entire life is pellets. That is what they associate food with. They were spawned in a rearing pond. They were moved to a holding pond. They were grown to a certain length. For the fish that get stocked here, that's going to be somewhere between 12 inches and 6 pounds. So 6 pounds is going to be, you know, maybe 24, 25 inches. So somewhere between 12 and 25, but majority of fish, 12 to 16 inches. Those fish associate pellets with food. So the best technique for fishing for trout at Delesi Park at any given time is either going to be, we'll go with what they're used to, which is the setup that we showed for catfish. Don't use an egg weight that's that heavy. This is a 1/2 ounce. Use 1/4 ounce or less, even an 1/8 ounce. The little dumbbell weights, they have the little swivel head on the top of them. I don't think I have one sitting right here in front of me. But it's going to be a weight that looks like this with the little swivel on the top and the weight. but you want to get like an 1/8 ounce, but you're going to rig it the same way. You're going to put that swivel on about 12 to 16 inches below the hook. You are not obviously going to use a circle catfish hook. That's way too big. Your best bet is at any sporting goods store. They sell what's called snell hooks, snell knot hooks. Those are hooks that are, let me find a real small one that's not got a long shank. They're going to be about that size. The shank's going to be even shorter. The shank's probably only going to go to about right there, and there'll be an eyelid, and it'll be pre-tied. So it'll be, I mean, that line is probably 15-pound test or whatever, and they're usually about 12 inches long. And so instead of using a double barrel swivel or just a barrel swivel, I always say double, it's a barrel swivel, but 2 sides, 2-ended, you'll use one that's got a snap hook. So just a snap hook swivel where you can hook that snell hook with the line in it. It's got a loop on the top of them. They come pre-made like that. You're going to put that on the snap swivel with an 1/8 ounce sinker, and you're going to get power bait. You're going to get, I mean, these are crappie nibbles, but you're going to go buy your basic power bait brand. Doesn't really matter color. I use purple nymph when I trout fish with power bait. That's just personal preference, but do they make a difference? I don't know. I doubt it. I mean, I grew up on the West Coast with a fly rod, lots of trout and lots of lakes. So I spent a good amount of time fishing with power bait off the bottom as a kid, kind of like how kids grew up here fishing for sunfish. I did it with trout. Purple nymph, Captain America, chartreuse, whatever. And you're going to ball it. Now, the important thing to know about trout, and this is where people get frustrated when they fish for trout with power bait, you're obviously using a very small hook. Trout have very unusual mouths compared to your normal freshwater species that exist in Oklahoma, your native species. They're more of a they're more like a mouse pad almost. You know, they look like this. They're more shaped. Whereas like your bass and crappie, it's more circular with the clear film where their mouth actually expands when they take in food. Trout are more like, you know, if you make it with your hand where they open up like this. They're very finicky when it comes to like taking power bait. So that's why you get that very prototypical dink, 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 and then you hammer down like it's a bass rod, and no, there's no power bait, no fish. So that's why the smaller the hook on those snells, you know, you could probably get smaller than that as far as a hook, but I mean, that size would work. I mean, that's perfect size, but anything smaller than that. But when you put that power bait on it, so I'll do it because we can mold some of these together, because this is basically crappie nibbles. You're basically just power bait that's pre-cut and molded into smaller chunks. So they just slide on the hook, but I'll mash them together to show you. So if you're putting power bait on, you stick your finger in that deal, you pop it out, you get your deal of power bait, work it over in your hand pretty good. It's going to stick on your fingers, you know, have a towel, water bottle, whatever. But really work it good, like get some heat on it because it'll help mold that deal. So you already have your ball made. So when you go to put that hook on, stick the hook like that, like stick it up against the side and then kind of work it on and then just fold that power bait around it. And again, because of the way that trout's mouth are built, you want to be able to cover the entire hook point. That's what you want. You don't want that hook showing at all. I mean, you want to cover it all the way up to the eyelid, basically. Because when those trout come and they peck at it, they're pecking, they're pecking, they're pecking. They want to take it, but they're pecking, they're pecking. They feel that hook. So a lot of times you'll get dink, 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 and that fish goes away. You reel in, you still have most of your power bait because they're just pecking around it. So as little power bait as you can get to fully encompass your hook, when you get that dink, 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 just start to slowly reel, like just as slow as possible until you feel that next reel is just tension. Like that fish it's done biting it, it's grabbed it, it's not hooked, but you have the tension. The second you feel that, hammer down. But it is a very, if we want to talk finesse fishing with bait, power bait fishing for trout is about as finesse as it gets. They are incredibly difficult, incredibly frustrating to throw something that's that small right in front of them, and they just peck all your bait away and then it's gone. So that's a good question. We're going to do a trout series of this where we're just going to be talking trout and all types of trout in November. So if you like this course at all, if it was helpful, join us for that one, and we'll be talking specifically trout. Anybody else got anything that's piqued your interest, or you might want to try, or anything? I got a bunch of gear around here, so we can pretty much talk about anything or everything. So we didn't really cover any of the power type fishing, jigs, crankbaits, because again, they're successful in ponds. They can be, but on average, that's just not a good like mentality to take into a small pond. You just learning pond, like especially if you go to the same body of water over and over again, that's just going to make you more successful. And then you can experiment with that stuff. But going into a pond for the first time or a small body of water and just, you know, throwing, if it's not top water and it's a big bait, whether that be a lipped crankbait or a spinner baits are very popular for bass anglers, but it's just not going to yield the results that you're looking for. You might plug that one fish, but it's better to start with small baits, catch a multitude of species so you know what's in the pond, because that's obviously the most important thing, is knowing what's in there. And then what's your average size of fish? People ask us all the time, like, hey, I got a pond, I want you to stock it. We need some channel cats, we need this, we need that. And we ask them, we say, what's in your pond? Well, I don't know. I mean, I catch some bass, I catch some. Manual creel surveys done by anglers is the most effective way to know what's in your pond and how good that pond is. Some people, they need that visual where they'll actually take a notebook. If it's their own pond, or maybe it's a neighborhood pond that they fish all the time, they want to do a manual creel, take a notepad with you and a tape measure. Measure every fish you catch. Jot down time of day and the size, length of fish and what species. You do that a dozen times in the span of 3-4 weeks, especially at good times a year for fishing, you're going to learn a lot about your pond. And even neighborhood ponds, that aren't yours, but you fish them all the time, you can still manage them. You as the angler are the management tool. And obviously impoundments are unnatural to begin with, so how fish exist within them is unnatural. So sometimes it requires human intervention to get that ecological balance back into place. Sometimes it sorts itself out, but you as the angler, you are the management tool. And so you should always be thinking that way, especially for ponds. It's just more success, smaller body of water, fish are, in a barrel. Will this presentation be posted to YouTube so we can watch it again? Yes, this presentation is being recorded. It will be put up on our website as well as our Outdoor Oklahoma YouTube channel later this afternoon after we're done with this presentation. Anybody have anything else? We still have 25 minutes of time left, so ask away, or I'll start rambling off on some other pond fishing tangent. Okay, nothing on that. All right, well, I got at least one more thing that we can talk about that will help you become a better pond angler. So all the stuff that we talked about today, all the different species, the few lures that we covered, the biggest thing for pond fishing or creek fishing, or really fishing in general, identifying what works and then consolidating it to when you go fishing. So, for example, when I go fishing, anywhere I go, even on a lake for the most part, this is my bag. This is my backpack. Not very big. got 3 pockets on it, you know, to hold gear, and that's it. That's all I use. I overfishing ponds consistently for the last decade. I've been able to establish within 1 bag what I need to take. I have taken this bag everywhere. This has gone from Montana to Arkansas to Iowa to North Carolina to Florida to New Mexico. I just swap out what I know that I'll use, but it fits in this bag. The biggest thing with anglers, especially for ones who, you know, fish close to home areas or fish ponds, you know, places around your house, you go to Bass Pro or you go to Walmart, you go to Academy, and you get hung up. I mean, we're kind of like Jack Russells with the ball when it comes to angling, man. You go to Bass Pro, you walk down every aisle, your eyes get big. You're like, I need that. 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 You end up with all this stuff in your garage or your, you know, warehouse or, you know, shed, whatever you got at where you keep your gear at your home, or, and you look at it, and if you ever like organize it and put it in a bunch of boxes and stack it up against each other, you're kind of like, why do I have all this gear? I didn't even use this box in 5 years. Breaking it down, buy small tackle boxes. Don't buy big, like I can fit 30 crankbaits in this. You won't ever need it. Tournament anglers have, and Bass Pro with good marketing has, you know, produced this idea that when you go fishing, you need 37 rods, 37 tackle boxes, the same crankbait in the same color in 30 different sizes, and that same crankbait in all 30 other colors in the same 30 different sizes. You don't need that. Then if you go back and you look at the history of fishing lures, they used to be handmade by guys, not for wholesale, and it worked. Artificial in fishing is relatively recent. I mean, the last 130 odd, 40 odd years. Before that, it was commercial. I mean, you use nets, man. We were eating fish. We need the fish. We're not fishing for fun. We're fishing for food. And then that kind of boiled over into people were fishing for fun, but they're using live bait. I mean, they're using what the fish actually eat. And again, if you're the type of angler who is into bait fishing, night crawlers, fish that exist in the pond, being able to catch a sunfish and either fish it whole, alive for bass, or cut it in half and catch bass, catfish, turtles. You got a bunch of turtles in your pond, or anything else. They can, you know, eat that half of a fish. So consolidation. Get it to where it fits on your back. You can carry it in a pack. You have 1, maybe 2 fishing rods. You know, unless you were just the type of angler who does everything year round, you only need 2 rods, maybe 3. You know, a good catfish, like a big sturdy rod. If you ever catfish or striper, you're trying to catch fish that are over 10 pounds. A good medium action rod that's very versatile. You can catch anything from sunfish to up to 10, 12 pound fish, and then a micro rod. And that covers every body of water. And then the tackle boxes you build off of that, you shouldn't really have more than 2 or 3 just really go-to boxes of things that are consistent everywhere in the state. And not only in the state, our latitude east. So if you go to Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, they're all the same. You know, that there's little tiny variations of things, but for the most part, you can fish the same way, the same color. If you just drive I-40 to the coast, either direction, and you're going to have success. So you just don't need a whole bunch of gear unless that's just what you're into. I mean, you do it all the time and you need it, then good on you. Are solar lunar tables helpful for no? That is, man, if I knew the answer to that, I would have the answer to all fishing. It's like a farmer's almanac. It's hard to say scientifically whether or not that is accurate everywhere. Social science says that lunar tables and farmer's almanacs for like fish bite, hunting activity consistently are more right than wrong. But there's no there's no like exact accuracy to it. If that's something that you use, and you catch fish and you're confident on it, well, then it works for you and it's true for you. And again, that's a lot of fishing. You turn on any bass tournament, especially right now, there's not a lot of other sports going on. Turn on ESPN2 every Saturday and Sunday from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. and they have live Bassmasters Elite Series going on. And here's 20 of the, quote unquote, best bass anglers in the world. They're all using different things on the same body of water. So what does that tell you? That's the same thing. I'm sure some of those guys, they get real gung-ho onto this time of day, this time of bite. So they're helpful if they're helpful to you. I would not discourage you from using them, but figuring out these certain, obviously they're going to be more successful at better times of the year. So if you're reading the lunar table in October and November and March, April, and May, they're going to seem a lot more accurate most of the time. But I know people who follow them religiously, and I know people who just think it's a, old wives' tale or witch's tale or whatever. So it's kind of, it's up to you. But my recommendation would be, if you use them and if you build success using them, go for it. I mean, use that. I mean, a lot of angling is confidence. You have to have confidence in what you're doing every time you hit the water, no matter what it is. That's like any sport. You can't go into it without having that confidence ahead of time. Our fish stocking schedule is available for close to home fishing lakes. Not currently. We don't have that on our website as far as the exact dates. We try to produce news releases. So if you're signed up through our website, you can go and you can just click on close to home news releases, and we try to get that information out there when we have it. Most fish stocking at close to home is done in the spring. This year, because of COVID, we had some postponements and some cancellations, but producing a true schedule of when things are actually stocked is nearly impossible because there's so many variations. Sometimes a truck breaks down. Sometimes the fish aren't ready at a hatchery. Sometimes an employee is on vacation. So we try to release fish stocking schedules like, hey, these bodies of water have been stocked in the last 2 weeks, but an exact date, we don't produce that just because we can't accurately forecast the exact days. But our fishing resources page on our website, we are trying to include some more of that specific information. So maybe in the future, we'll get to where, hey, this week, here's the bodies of water that were stocked. What is a good rod reel setup for catfish? If we're talking just setup versus brands, 7-foot rod, 7-foot heavy rod, or 7'6". They're really, you don't need more rod than you can handle. So, I mean, you could have an 8 or 9 foot rod, but why? It's going to take some of the tension off from catching fish, but a 7-foot heavy rod. So when you flip it over, I think I actually have the base of a catfish rod. So here is like a basic Bass Pro setup. So this is a 7-foot heavy action that's got a spin casting rod on it. So this is the button. Works great because catfishing is done sedentary. Most of the time catfishing is associated with sitting in a lawn chair or cooler and casting out, letting it sit and soak. So a spinning reel or a bait casting reel or a spin casting reel is not as important, just whatever you're comfortable with. That is an 888 Zebco. So it can hold, 30-pound test, 50-pound test, and it can hold 200 yards of it. That's the most important thing for bigger fish. So your rod for bigger fish, 7 foot and up and heavy action, which means that the actual rod deck itself from top eyelid down to the reel base is more of the same consistency. It doesn't taper as much. So it's heavy throughout those last eyelids. Like this doesn't bend like this little 5'6" rod does at the top. So that's all you need. And then whatever reel you're most comfortable with, make sure that it can hold at least 200 yards of whatever pound test you're putting on for whatever size fish you think you might catch. So if you're going to a big reservoir and you could catch a 6-inch channel cat or a 60-pound blue cat, probably 30-pound mono, 200 yards, so that the fish can take line and you're not in any threat of like losing the line, you know, getting completely spooled out, which doesn't generally happen with terminal equipment for spinning or casting reels. It can happen on a fly rod. You don't have nearly as much line on that reel. So that's the most important thing. And then brands are up to you. If you fish enough, you'll find certain brands and certain reels and rods that you just really take to. For some people, it doesn't matter at all. So brands will be on you, but 7-foot rod, something that can hold at least 180 to 220 yards of 30-pound mono for catfish. Interested in learning my thoughts on brands. Again, it's everybody's preference. I myself personally have a lot of Abu Garcia stuff and Luz, but I kind of have a little bit of everything as far as brands are concerned. I've never got stuck on one or the other for too long. If you use the same brand over and over again, you're more than likely to have success and failure with the actual equipment itself, just because the more you use one thing, the odds increase in both directions. If you're looking for like, I mean, rods is all about feel. So every rod, no matter of make or model, is going to be different for everybody. Because it's an extension of your arm and your hand. I mean, that is your personal touch. That is your paintbrush for fishing. Some people like a heavier rod. Some people like a lighter action rod. And they make those. I mean, like G Loomis makes $400 spinning reel rods. Shakespeare makes $4 spinning reel rods. They both catch fish. Reels, maybe it plays more in because there's more mechanics that go into it. But most brands are fairly reliable. Abu, Luz, Daiwa. I mean, unless you're just getting like the basic stuff from Walmart, the Shakespeare, the stuff that's mass produced, you might get a Shakespeare reel that lasts 30 years. You might get a Shakespeare reel that lasts 30 minutes. The odds increase of mechanical failures the cheaper the equipment is. But there's nothing to say that that same expensive $300 reel isn't going to have the same, you know, bad bolt or something that's internal. I've had bad luck with bait casters in Abu. I love Abu Garcia. I've had 2 bait casters in the last 3 years that like they just cut. I mean, literally, I opened them up and there was broken ball bearings just from straight reeling, like not wear and tear. So that's kind of up to each person to just figure out along the way. And if you're really interested in brands, there's a million fishing forums that you can go, product reviews. Fish Findly, I think, is the name of the website, where all they do is product reviews. I might have I think I have a link for that I can supply you with. It's worth a shot. I mean, all they do is talk about just brands and peer review of those said brands. Yeah, I think fishfindly.com. I'll put this in there. They have a lot of ads on that website, so you kind of just have to type into the search bar or go to product review, but that's where you can review products and peer review, and it's good info. It's not going to lead you astray, but it's a lot advertising based, so you kind of run into that. You get product endorsement. You may or may not get great, you know, reliable information if people are trying to pump a certain brand. Okay, we got about 10 minutes left. Anybody else got any other questions on anything? Okay, nothing yet. I guess the one topic that we didn't quite cover that we can cover right now, if nobody's got any other questions, is top water. for ponds, for bass primarily. Really good topwater for bass on ponds is going to be your terrestrial based deals. So you're either mimicking the bait fish that are dying, that get up on the top. So some type of like a spook or a torpedo. Keaton makes the tried and true, just poppers and torpedoes and spooks and puppies and any terminology you can have. Hidden brand, they've been doing it forever. So they kind of have your basic something that's like this. So this is meant to be fished where it's got nothing to it. So there's no this one has some balls inside of it to create a little bit of noise, but outside of that, there's no appendages, there's no buzzer on the back, there's no hanging anything. So this is basically meant to be fished where when you cast it out, all you're doing is you're pulling the rod tip straight down. So if that rod's in your hand, you're just doing that. And what that does to that lure is on the surface, it does this. All it's doing is turning just back and forth, super slow. Most of the time, bass investigate before they hit. So you might have a bass on your topwater bait for a long time. It might follow it for a long ways. Generally, they hit topwater after the pause. So you'll be working, it'll go dink, 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 dink. And that bass will be sitting right there ready. And it's still, the second that you twitch it again, that bass hits. Topwater baits are the hardest lure to set the hook on. Most people are over anxious. That bass comes up. It's exciting. It's exhilarating. There's nothing better than topwater fishing. I mean, it's sight fishing. But that bass, it hits it. A lot of times they don't hit it well. There's light refraction, coming off the surface of the water. So they see, like we see into the water, it oftentimes looks bigger and closer than it actually is. So lots of times they hit it at inopportune angles where the hook might not be able to get it. I am as guilty as anybody. I tell myself over and over again, patience, patience, patience. Wait. Let that fish hit that topwater and take it back underwater. Wait for the fish and the lure to disappear before you set the hook. Because if you don't, 60-70% of the time, you're just ripping that lure straight out of the fish's mouth because it was never hooked to begin with. It just hit it at a weird angle. Double trebles increases your odds. Hollow-bodied frogs that have like a dual reverse on the back of that frog. I mean, those things, that's like striking lightning in a bottle trying to set the hook with those, because the purpose is that fish hit a hollow-bodied frog, they clamp down, and when they clamp down, that plastic rubber bends or it sucks in, and then the hook point is completely exposed. Whoever designed it, I mean, it's great in theory, but it's very difficult. If you, especially with those, I mean, you'll pull those out of fish's mouth all day. So anything like a little popper like this, this is small enough that this will catch sunfish. It will, every now and then you might get a crappie that will come up and hit a surface bait. But mostly surface fishing is for bass and ponds. Jitterbugs. This is probably my favorite topwater hard bait. If you can catch them on buzz baits, great. Buzz baits are awesome. It's just like a spinner bait. Cast it straight out, just strip it in. There's no thought process, nothing. You're just casting and retrieving. So if you can get that, great. But again, it's kind of shell-shocking fish. That's a lot of motion. That's a lot of noise. They're not generally used to that. Guys use them on reservoirs. There's boat motors going all day. There's lots and lots of surface activity on bigger bodies of water. Hence, the fish are more likely to hit bigger, loud, reactionary baits, which is all these are. The little soft plastics that we have, these are meant to mimic an actual food source. Hard baits are meant to mimic a food source in a very unnatural fashion, because fish are predators and a lot of it is just reactionary. It's not feeding. It's not feeding instinct. They're not eating because they're hungry. They're feeding because you have disrupted the balance that's around them. And that's how topwater works. usually you're fishing somewhat shallow, sheltered water, and you're running it straight across, and that bass is either sitting on its little home bed or its little hole that it's got, you know, its territory on, and it sees, you know, a big cheeseburger coming across the top, and it might go after it because it thinks it's a big frog, or you might have just, you know, disrupted its day, and it's going up to swipe at it to kill it, and might, you know, maybe not necessarily eat it. They're just territorial protecting, but you still set the hook. But jitterbugs are awesome because they have that big front on them, so they can be fished with a really slow retrieve, and all they do is they wobble. So it just does this the entire way in, and it creates a little bit of surface wake, and you're creating that vibration for that lateral line. So jitterbug does a really good job on a pond of staying quiet while producing the type of disruption that's needed to either stimulate a fish's lateral line feeding instinct or predatory territorial instinct. And then you have like your big plugs and jugs that you can throw out there. But these two are, and these are just basic brand jitterbugs. One's full black. This is probably my go-to most of the time. I always use darker colors, unless it's just a crystal clear pond. When you're fishing dirty water in Oklahoma, or, you know, what's considered stained, that you want to use darker, naturally colored baits. Those lighter color baits, they don't look as good because a lot of it's just shadow based. So if you're fishing a little bit of stained water, if you're fishing in the water column or on top of the water column, again, those fish coming from down below, they're looking for that shadow that mimics what they're looking to eat. So darker colors for top water, blacks, blues. And then if it's a clearer body of water, if you can maybe see down to the bottom out to like 6-7 feet, then you can go with some like white belly, because again, that dark with that sunlight being able to come in, it'll go over the top of the water, and they'll see that white underbelly and then the shadow on the top. But if it's stained water, that white belly is not going to help you at all. So being fully dark is going to produce more of, you know, that coloration and that shadow and that figure that that predatory fish is looking to eat. So that's pretty much it that we got for today. We've got about a minute left. If anybody's got just that hot tip question that they want to ask right now. Other than that, this is going to be a series. Every virtual class that we're going to do over the next 4 or 5 months, we're going to cover different species, but it's going to be done in a similar format. We'll have a couple of talking points for the first hour and then open it up for Q&A. So I would encourage any of you, the next one is stream fishing. If you were interested in pond fishing because it's close to your house, you don't have a boat, you're not familiar with fishing big water, I would encourage you to join our stream fishing clinic, virtual clinic next month. It's going to cover a lot of these same topics, but for stream bass, we'll talk about trout a little bit. It's mainly for warm water, warm, clear water streams in eastern Oklahoma, which is a blast. I mean, that is, other than pond fishing, it doesn't get a lot better than targeting, you know, those are native fish in their native habitats. And you learn a lot about just fish by going after those species that you catch in ponds and lakes, targeting them in their natural environment in an Oklahoma clear water, warm water species stream. Other than that, we're at 3 o'clock. We're at the end of this. Thank you all so much for coming. I hope this was helpful. You all obviously got the email for the link. So if you have any other pressing questions, feel free to email me, call me, visit our fishing resources webpage at wildlifedepartment.com. And then look at the outdoor events page again for upcoming virtual clinics. We're also going to have some in-person pond fishing clinics. One's tonight, one's next Tuesday, and then the following Tuesday, and we'll do some more, and we'll try to get more across the state, Tulsa, Lawton, Durant, Enid, metros here before November. So appreciate everybody coming. Stay safe, enjoy the fall, keep those lines tight, and if you got any questions, feel free to reach out to me. But sign off. Thanks so much for joining us.